Hey everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I don't know when you're watching this, but we want to say hello and welcome to the online gathering of the Pathways Church community. My name is Nick. I'm sort of your tour guide here for this online experience. And wow, what an incredible weekend it is in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, it has just been beautiful. Friday, I think we got somewhere around the 80s in the Puget Sound area. And yesterday, Saturday, it was again just gorgeous. And so that is something that we needed. We've had a lot of rain recently and just cold weather, so it's nice to see the sunshine. And it just, seeing the sun come out makes you feel hopeful. And hope that you feel hopeful today, no matter how much kind of metaphorical rain and cold may have been in your life recently. I pray that today you feel the warmth of hope, the brightness of joy and hope that Jesus wants you to experience here today. So we want to welcome you to our experience here. If this is your first time hanging out with us and are unfamiliar with this group, you can get to know us better by going to our website, findpathways.com, and you can read up on us a little bit there and get to know us a little bit based on some of the words that we choose. And I know that it's hard to get to know someone from afar. Okay, what kind of group is this? But we have intentionally thrown out some words there on our website that would give you kind of a sense of who we are. And of course, nothing on a screen or on paper can fully capture the essence of a group, our personality, but it can give you some clues, perhaps, at least, to what kind of group that we are. And I hope that you'll especially pay attention to our core values that are listed in the corner of the screen here. But if you go to our website, you can read a little bit more about what we mean by these things. They're just several things that on our journey here together we've decided to kind of slow down and value along the way because we believe that they have something to teach us and to help us to grow and to become the fullest expression of who we were made to be. So if you want to check out more of that, you just go to our website and you can learn a little bit about us. Now, we often introduce ourselves with the two words that many of you who have been around here for a while could repeat on your own, and that's the words cautious and curious. We are a cautious group because many of us have grown up with some sort of religious context. It's sort of hard to grow up in the Western world, in the United States anyway, without some sort of religious context. And many of us have grown up in Christianity or other Christian contexts, and we have seen religion used in some ways that are very beneficial and helpful and wonderful. But of course, we've also seen religion used in some ways that are very hurtful, in nationalistic ways, in exclusive ways, in ways that demeaned or harmed or threatened other people. And that has sort of left us a little cautious about organized religion. So we are a church, but we're a church that's a little skeptical of how organized religion can very quickly get off track. And so we kind of live in this weird tension of being an organized group, but also a little skeptical of how organized religion can spiral out of control. We're also a very curious group. That's our other word here, curious. We like to ask a lot of questions. And one of the things that we feel that organized religion has often done a poor job is eliciting and being okay with questions for people to examine ways of thinking that they may have had in the past that have been handed down to them and ask those things some questions and be willing to rethink different ways of thinking that may have been handed down. And so we're a group that likes to ask a lot of questions. It's sort of what's gotten many of us in trouble in other religious environments is because we asked too many questions that felt a little too disturbing to ask. And so this is a group where we like to rethink things. In fact, that's part of what we're doing in our series right now is rethinking a lot of things about the Bible material. So if either of those two words kind of resonates with you, cautious and curious, or maybe both, then this might be a really good group for you. Now, what we're going to be doing here in this online space for the next few moments, let me just kind of give you a sketch of where we're going. The first thing that's going to happen is Billy, our worship leader, is going to lead us in a couple songs, and sandwiched beneath, or in between rather, his songs is a little video with a section of Psalm 139 in it, which I am going to actually be referencing later, but it's a beautiful, poetic piece of scripture that is supposed to bring comfort to those of us who read it. And so that'll happen in between those two songs. You can sing along, you can just kind of hum along, you can meditate or pray, whatever you would like to do there. Then after that, I'm going to come back on the screen and we're going to continue in our series about the violence that we find in the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. and how do we reconcile that with the peace-loving, non-violent ways of Jesus himself. And so I'll share a little message on that. I think that has some good tips this week on how we can redeem some of those violent texts and use them in more positive, helpful ways. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with the time of communion. And so in our in-person gatherings, we usually have communion elements prepared and ready, and at a certain point, people can come up and they can take the bread, they can take the cup, which are just symbols that Jesus left behind to commemorate his death, burial, and resurrection. And though we do provide that for our people in person, of course we can't provide that for everyone online. So this might be a good moment, if you want to participate in that, to go scrounge up some items that you could use for the communion moment. Maybe you've got some crackers in the pantry, you really just a chunk of bread, you don't need much. Or for the cup, if you have some juice or some wine left over from last night, you can get that out as well. And again, you don't need a lot, just a little. Although, if it's wine, you might want a little bit more. So what we're going to do is we'll have a time here where Billy will come back on the screen, and you're welcome to take communion and remember the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus here with us. Okay, so that's a little sketch of where we're going here today. And why don't we just jump right into it? Billy will lead us in some singing, and then after that, I'll come back up on the screen. Okay, we'll see you in a few minutes. Billy, take it away.
Song of all songs is the song we sing. Song of our sounds, heaven's symphony. Songs of love to you from us all. Songs of praise, you're the one we adore. We're gonna sing out aloud as heaven is us and comes down in this day that we live. We'll show our love with such awesome praise. You are great and greatly to be praised. In all the earth, you are strong and powerful. In all the world, in all the heavens, you are God, so wonderful. All of heaven knows your name. You are great and greatly to be praised. Song of all songs is the song we sing. Sound of all sounds, heaven's symphony. Songs of love to you from us all. Songs of praise, you're the one we adore. We're gonna sing out aloud as heaven is us and comes down in this day that we live. We'll show our love with such awesome praise. You are great and greatly to be praised. In all the earth, you are strong and powerful. In all the world, in all the heavens, you are God, so wonderful. All of heaven knows your name. great. You are great, greatly to be praised in all the earth, in all the earth. You are strong, powerful in all the world, in all the heavens. You are God, so wonderful. All of heaven knows your name. You are great and greatly to be praised. You are great and greatly to be praised in all the earth, in all the earth. You are strong and powerful in all the world, in all the heavens. You are God, so wonderful. All of heaven knows your name. You are great and greatly to be praised. I've tried so hard to see it. Took me so long to believe it, that you choose someone like me to carry your victory. Perfection could never earn it. Give what we don't deserve it. You take the broken things and raise them to glory. You are my champion. Giants fall when you you stand undefeated. Every battle you've won. I am who you say I am. You crown me with confidence. I'm seated in the heavenly place, undefeated, with the one who has conquered it all. Now I can finally see it. You're teaching me how to receive it. So let all the striving cease. Oh, this is my victory. You are my champion. Giants fall when you stand undefeated. Every battle you've won. I am who you say I am. You crown me with confidence. I'm seated in the heavenly place, undefeated, with the one who has conquered it all and all and all and all. The one who has conquered it all. Yeah. When I lift my voice and shout, everyone comes crashing down. I have the authority Jesus has given me. When I open up my mouth, miracles start breaking out. I have the authority Jesus has given me. When I lift my voice and shout, every wall comes crashing down. I have the authority, yeah, Jesus has given me. When I open up my mouth, miracles start breaking out. I have the authority, yes I do. Jesus has given me. You are my champion. Giants fall when you stand undefeated. Every battle you've won. I am who you say I am. You crown me with confidence. I'm seated in the heavenly place, undefeated. By the power of your name, I'm seated in the heavenly place, undefeated, with the one who has conquered it all. You are my champion. Giants fall when you stand undefeated. Every battle you won. I am who you say I am. You crown me with confidence. I'm seated in the heavenly place, undefeated, by the power of your name. I'm seated in the heavenly place, undefeated, with the one who has conquered it all. I know who I am, 'cause I know whose I am. Hallelujah.
What is the good news that Christians always talk about?
It's like the God who created us and all that is so like present in such ordinary things and flawed, inconsistent people in this life. It's not like some transcendent reality. We have to like somehow float above reality and transcend this life in order to access that eternal love of God. It's hidden in these offensively ordinary things, and bread and wine and table fellowship and frustrating, gorgeous human beings, and we bump up against it all the time, and it's always there. And somehow the sort of suffering love of God is present in these ordinary things and in our own suffering and the compassion we can have for other people. And it just, all that just frees us to not care so much about the shit that doesn't matter. Like we get this kind of freedom from stuff that feels like a lot of people are in bondage to. That feels like good news to me. And the fact that like all of that broken ass junk inside of me, all those mistakes, all the selfishness and the resentment and the anger and all the stuff that's kind of bound up inside of me, ultimately all of that is fodder for God, like somehow, and I don't know why, but God gets to use every single ounce of that in a really redemptive way in my life. Like my parishioners get so much more out of the fact that I'm like somebody who had a huge problem controlling their drinking, like the fact that I'm a recovering alcoholic and that I've struggled with depression, and somehow that's so much more useful to my parishioners than the fact that I passed Greek in seminary, right? So this is the weird sort of upcycling God that we have, just constantly making use of these little deaths that we experience.
Oh, that's a great word there by Nadia Bolz-Weber. We appreciate that. That was really great. The idea that God can use everything, even the broken parts of us, and redeem them into something beautiful. I mean, that old statement, that people say where if life gives you lemons, make lemonade. I mean, really no one does that better than God himself. God can take the worst situation and he can make the best out of it. It's something that we call redemption. And God can take things that are broken, lifeless, dead, and redeem them and bring something beautiful and life-filled out of them. Love that, the idea of redemption. That's what we're going to talk about a little bit here today. Now, my friend Rick contracted HIV in 1989. He was a doctor in Florida at the time, and he was helping a patient, and he got stuck with a needle, and he contracted HIV. And HIV in 1989, well, it was a death sentence. I know it's a kind of a chronic manageable disease today, but in 1989, it was a death sentence. And life got really rough for my friend Rick. I mean, he had to all of a sudden start taking all these treatments, experimental treatments that made him feel terrible. Eventually, his wife divorced him, and he became estranged from his kid. He lost his job. He couldn't work as a doctor anymore because he had HIV. And then eventually, he had to leave his home there in Florida, and he ended up moving all the way out here to the Puget Sound, to the Seattle area. And he moved out here, and he said he figured he would just die here. But as he got out here and got in touch with the doctor and started some more treatments, he decided that while he waited to die, maybe he could be of some help. And he didn't want anyone else to get HIV. And so he had heard that there were these gay bathhouses in Seattle, and he assumed that probably HIV was spreading in some of these environments. And so he would show up there every day and he would hand out safer sex kits to the people who would go in. And then after that, he began helping get people tested for HIV right there on site. I mean, today there are like take-home tests, like your COVID test, your at-home test that you can take. But back then there weren't. And so he got the health department to show up, and he was there talking people into getting an HIV test right there so they could find out their status. And then he became a speaker in local schools and with other teen groups. And really, over the years, Rick helped a lot of people. He took the bad situation that he was in and he found something good and meaningful. And he said later that ultimately what he found was redemption. His life had been lost, but then he had been redeemed. You see, bad situations can be redeemed. Maybe not entirely fixed, but used as a catalyst for something else that is truly beautiful and good. And that's what we want to talk about today. That just as though bad circumstances and situations God can redeem and use for good, that God can take the violent texts of the Old Testament and redeem them and point us to something good as well. Now, we're doing a series here called Construction Zone. It's our second season of this series. The first season, we talked about the Bible material, and we deconstructed some ways of thinking about the Bible that many of us had passed down to us, and then reconstructed some maybe more useful ways of thinking about the Bible material. This time, we're talking about violence, both in the Bible text and in our own lives. But primarily, our question has been, how do we reconcile the violence that we find in the Old Testament with the command by Jesus to love our enemies, and of course his example to love his enemies, to even lay down his life for them. Now, in this series, we've taken our time walking through some pretty violent passages in the Old Testament. There are passages calling for genocide against entire groups of people in the name of God. There are texts calling for infanticide, the killing of babies and children. And as we've gone through this series, some of us weren't even really aware that there was that much violence in the Old Testament. I mean, we knew some was there, but I think I've heard feedback from some of you who said, wow, I didn't know there was quite that specific of violence, quite that horrific of violence in the Bible. And then, of course, some of us who knew there was some violence there had been so used to the explanations that justified the violence that we read there that we never really put it together in our head how much tension there was between that God-ordained violence in the Old Testament and these peaceful, non-violent ways of Jesus himself. And so, in this series, we've had to do some deconstruction on previous ways of thinking, right? Admitting that there's some violence here, and also then admitting that it doesn't seem to fit very well with Jesus, and we've had to deconstruct some of the ideas that have tried to hold that together in place for us. But not only in this construction zone do we want to tear down things, we also want to rebuild something in its place, at least the opportunity to rebuild something. And so last week we started some reconstruction, and we began to talk about, then what do we do with these violent texts? And so a bit of a recap from last week, since this is sort of a part 2 today. Last week we asked how do we deal with these violent texts, and the first thing I said is we got to own them. They're part of our scriptures. They're part of our holy scriptures, and we got to deal with them. And we may not like the fact that Christianity has a history with violence, but the truth is, it does. And we have to own that, because if we don't own it, we will repeat it. The second thing I said we need to do with these violent texts is we need to read them. And I know there are groups of people today, particularly more progressive Christians, who just want to eliminate these texts out of their Bible because they don't want to end up justifying or highlighting violence. And I can certainly understand that. But the case I made last week was that we need to read these because, again, if we don't read them, we will end up not engaging in the conversations that they bring up, and then we may end up repeating them. And so I don't think ignoring them is a responsible way to deal with them. I think we actually need to engage them and take them head on. And then finally, what I said last week is that we also then need to reject them, which doesn't mean that we don't read them or we cut them out of our Bible, of course. It means we reject the violence that is in these texts, that we reject the premise that God would want us to engage in violence or that violence in some way could be justified. And of course, the reasons, there were many reasons that we looked at last week, but the main reason is because Jesus himself rejects the violence in these Old Testament texts, and we are following Jesus and should read the Bible the way that our rabbi Jesus reads the Bible. But today, what we want to focus on is the last part of what we do with these violent texts that we didn't have a lot of time to unpack last week, and we want to spend some time talking about today. And that is, how do we redeem these texts, right? How can these violent Bible passages be redeemed into something beautiful and actually faithful to the person of Jesus? Now, bad situations can be redeemed, and violent Bible texts actually can too. In fact, we've already seen this in previous sermons. You can go back and watch them if you want to. But Jesus and Paul used these Old Testament texts of terror or texts of violence, and they repurpose them or redeem them in ways that point to nonviolence and love. In fact, Paul directly quotes violent passages and then reinterprets them to mean exactly the opposite of what they meant in the Old Testament. So we've already got a pattern from that from Jesus and Paul, but how do we then engage in this way of reinterpreting and reading the Bible through the eyes of Jesus? How can we allow God to speak through these Bible texts, even these texts that we don't particularly like that are violent, and allow the Spirit of God to speak through them in a fresh way? I think God still speaks through the Bible text. I believe it is living and active, that God can speak a fresh word through it today. And so that's what I do, is give you a couple helpful hints here about how we might allow the Spirit of God to redeem these violent texts. And the first little hint is this: we begin to view them from the perspective of the victim. This is, I think, a really big, huge point here for us, that a part of the way the Spirit of God may want to speak in a fresh way through these violent texts is when we begin to view them from the perspective of the victim. Now, we've often read these texts from the perspective of those who are engaging in the violence, from the perspective of those who are believing that God wants them to fight or to kill their enemies, from the perspective of Israel or a leader of Israel or someone who is doing the engagement of the violence. But if we reject from the beginning the premise that we should engage in violence toward our enemies, and of course the reason we would want to reject that premise is because Jesus himself taught us not to engage in violence towards our enemies. And so if we reject the premise of using violence against our enemy from the very beginning, then we don't really need these scriptures to speak to us to justify violence in the name of God. That's already been ruled out by Jesus. So perhaps the value instead of these violent texts can be seen in the way that they help us see things from the perspective of those who are being harmed. Now, maybe the best way to illustrate this is to give you an example, and it's one that maybe you haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, but there's this sort of violent story in Leviticus. Well, there's several violent stories, but this is a pretty violent story. It's one that we don't read a lot because people don't know a lot of what to make of it, but it's the story of a woman named Shalomith and her son. And it takes place in Leviticus 24. So let's read it here, and then let's talk about it and see how this might be a story that we could view from the perspective of the victim. Leviticus 24, verse 10 starts this way. Now the son of an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father went out among the Israelites, and a fight broke out in the camp between him and an Israelite. The son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name, that's the name of God, with a curse. So they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shalomith, the daughter of Dibri, the Danite. They put him in custody until the will of the Lord should be made clear to them. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Take the blasphemer outside the camp. All those who heard him are to lay their hands on his head, and the entire assembly is to stone him. Say to the Israelites, anyone who curses their God will be held responsible. Anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord is to be put to death. The entire assembly must stone them, whether foreigner or native born. When they blaspheme the name, they are to be put to death. And then if we jump down to verse 23, it says, Then Moses spoke to the Israelites, and they took the blasphemer outside the camp and stoned him. The Israelites did as the Lord commanded Moses. Now, here in Leviticus 24 here, we have a strange story about a man who was stoned to death, apparently by the command of God given to Moses, for saying something unflattering about God. And it's a strange story because God sort of comes off easily threatened, a little insecure, as apparently Moses does as well. And the solution here to stone him for saying something unflattering about God, it just doesn't seem like a very Jesus-like solution. I mean, the penalty here is the death penalty. Now, like many stories in the Bible, it's really short on some details that we as modern readers might be curious about, right? I mean, there's all sorts of things that be like, hey, who is this kid? Is there a backstory here? And interestingly, even though we don't get those details in the Bible text, Jewish rabbis have actually speculated about this story for centuries. And there is a long tradition in Jewish history about what is happening in this story. It's sort of an obscure reference here for us, but in Jewish history, there is quite a story in the rest of their sort of oral and rabbinic tradition that explains the background story of what we have read here in Leviticus 24. It's part of what we call Midrash, which is kind of Jewish rabbinic commentary on a story. Now, let me give you kind of the background tradition because it might help us understand how we could begin to see this story from the perspective of the victim. Now, this story actually begins in Exodus, and you might be familiar with a little event that happens where Moses grows up in the palace of Pharaoh, you remember? And he sees an Egyptian taskmaster who is beating an Israelite slave. And as he sees this Egyptian beating the Israelite slave, he then kills the Egyptian taskmaster. And it's because of that he ends up having to flee from Egypt. And because Pharaoh will be upset with him, so he flees. And of course, as he flees to Midian, he ends up seeing God in a burning bush and all of that, right? But you remember, he kills this Egyptian and has to run away. Well, the Midrash, the Jewish commentary, elaborates on this incident and offers the following backstory for why Moses was so enraged and ended up killing this Egyptian taskmaster. And as the story goes, on this particular day, the Egyptian taskmaster had sent the Israelite slaves out to work. They were the slaves. He was overseeing them. And when they left, the story goes that this Egyptian taskmaster then raped one of the Israelite slaves' wives. And that wife happens to be our very own Shalomith bat Divri. Now, her husband, according to the Midrash, came back home unexpectedly and confronted the Egyptian taskmaster, who was then leaving his home. And the taskmaster began beating the Israelite husband as he had gotten caught. And it's at that moment that Moses comes upon the scene and sees what is happening and hears the woman screaming and steps in and kills the Egyptian rapist, which helps you understand here now with the backstory why Moses might have been so enraged as to kill this Egyptian rapist. Now, the Jewish rabbis go on to speculate whether or not the Egyptian violently raped Shalomith or merely just tricked her into having sex with him by pretending to be her husband. They sort of argue over that detail, but whatever the case was, because of the rape, she became pregnant as a consequence of this assault. And as the way nature works, in 9 months later, Shalomith gave birth to a son whom she loves, even though he's born in trauma, but who is looked down upon by other Israelites. Because as he grows up, everyone knows your dad's not your dad. You're a half-breed, an outsider. And at one point, after he gets older, he quarrels with a real Israelite. And who are you to quarrel with a real Israelite? You're not a real Israelite. You're just a half-breed. Now, it's the nature of this argument that he gets into with this other Israelite in Leviticus 24 that actually becomes rather revealing. In the rabbinic account, Shalom's son wanted to pitch his tent with the encampment of Dan, which was his mother's tribe. And the Danites who were there challenged him and said, "Why do you want to have your tent here?" And he replied, "Well, because I am from the daughters of Dan." To which they then retorted, "Okay, but Scripture says that the Israelites shall camp each with his standard under the banners of his father's house. And although your mother is from the daughters of Dan, your father is not from the sons of Dan. We don't even know who your dad is." And God said that the encampment should follow the father's line and not the mother's. In other words, you're a bastard and you should not be here with us. Now, of course, Shalom's son then is put off by this, and he petitioned the court of Moses and asked Moses to make a judgment in his case. And Moses takes up the case and ends up ruling against Shalom's son, saying he cannot camp pitch his tent in the encampment of Dan, declaring he couldn't dwell there with the Danites because he was a bastard and not truly a Danite. And then, of course, in anger or sadness or despair, it doesn't really tell us, Shalom's son leaves the court, and on his way out, he blasphemes. And what does that mean? Well, we don't know exactly what Shalom's son said. Some rabbis say he pronounced the divine name, which was supposed to not be said out loud, but others said he pronounced the divine name with a curse. Something akin to saying, "Curse all of you and your God for the way that you've treated me." So, because of this curse, he is brought to Moses again. He's held in jail until Moses can figure out what to do. And ultimately, Shalom's son is stoned to death. Now, this is a incredibly sad story. A boy born under sexual violence and killed under racial and religious violence. But all of a sudden, with this new background information, we start to consider the story from the perspective of the victims. I mean, how could you hear that whole background story from Jewish midrash, from the rabbinic tradition, and not start to feel for Shalomith and her son? Dr. Susan Surred, a professor of sociology from Suffolk University in Boston, she has said this about the text. While the biblical and midrashic texts hint at the pain experienced by Shalom's son, neither set of texts acknowledge Shalom's pain. The pain of the mother who sees her son rejected, picked on, kicked out of the group, mocked for his imperfections, derided for being different, judged, incarcerated, and finally murdered by and in the sight of the entire community. I can't help but wonder how Shalomith felt when her son was taunted. Did she stay awake at night, silently cursing both the Egyptian who raped her and the Israelite community that rejected her beloved son? Was she forced to witness his death? Did she collect his battered and bruised body from the field? Or was she perhaps forced to join the community who laid hands on his head before throwing the stones? Wow. This is fantastic commentary from Dr. Surred, who is helping us see, by asking these questions, she's helping us to see this violent story from the perspective of the victim. And perhaps when we read stories like this one with Shalomith and her son, we should allow the Spirit of God to redeem this violent story by allowing her, the Spirit of God, to guide us toward empathy of those who have suffered rejection and violence at the hands of religion, to help us see that the life and experiences of those who are often overlooked, and to give us a new perspective. This is a beautiful way to begin to open ourselves up to the possibility that the Spirit of God could redeem such a text like this, when we begin to have our hearts open to the victims of violence and abuse done in the name of God, by reading these stories from their perspective. Of course, when we do this, something else might happen that I would say is another way that these texts these texts of terror, these violent passages of the Bible can be redeemed. And that is that we then begin to use them as a mirror into our own hearts. When we read these stories and we view them from the perspective of the victim, the next thing that should happen is that they then begin to reveal within ourselves the proclivity and the desires for power and the inclination to engage in violent means. You see, once the Spirit uses this text to reveal the plight of the victims in these stories, and once she then uses that to help shine a light on those today who are also victims of such abuses, then the Spirit may go one step further and turn these texts into a mirror through which we might begin to see our own culpability in similar current stories and events. You see, how could Moses and the people treat Shaloma's son this way? And then we begin to ask, who is it that I mistreat, that I exclude, that I have done harm to in the name of God? You see, the Old Testament may indeed be filled of stories of religious-minded people who are thinking that military might and political manipulation and all these power overplays should be used to force people into compliance and make Israel great again. But those same temptations exist for religion today, for nationalist uses of religion today. And maybe now more than ever, we need these stories to use as a mirror to see how the use of the sword, or in this case of Shaloma's son, the use of stones to stone him, or the death penalties and the use of fear tactics and power and control, that they never really work. They never really accomplish what we hope that they will accomplish. I mean, Israel tried it again and again, and it did not produce what they had hoped. And so these stories can reveal the way that we tend toward those same means. And I pray that the Spirit can then, as she uses these texts to reveal our hearts, that illumination can cause us to reflect and repent of it. And this will happen when we read the text and then it forces us into difficult conversations. And that may be the third way here that I'd like to suggest that these texts can be redeemed. And that is when we invite the tension that are in these stories into our conversations as a church community. You see, when you read these stories from the perspective of the victim and then use them as a mirror into our own hearts, that is going to inevitably then, if we're reading them that way, lead to conversations that place us in the tension of how we are going to go on living. And I would say we need those conversations. Those conversations may be difficult, they may be hard, they may be contentious even, but they are necessary because it throws us into the tension, and we have to ask the question, what is the Jesus-like way to live in the world filled with evil and hurt? How do we live like Jesus? Great example of this tension is found in a text like Psalm 139. And Psalm 139 is, it's a famous psalm, maybe the most famous. Well, probably not. Psalm 23 is probably the most famous, but Psalm 139 is right up there. It's famous, it's beautiful, it's poetic. You'd know nearly every line of this psalm if you've been around church life. And we don't want to read the whole thing here today, but just some of the famous lines of Psalm 139, like, "You've searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me and your right hand will hold me fast." Wherever I go, God, you are there. Verse 13, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb, and I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." That is just beautiful scripture, isn't it? It's poetic. It's often quoted. It's put on magnets that we can put on our refrigerator. It's this comforting poetry about how God is always there. You can't go anywhere that God won't be there with you. He's there in every aspect of life. It's just incredibly comforting, beautiful poetry scripture. But usually, we stop reading about there. Because in verse 19, things get a little weird. The whole psalm is beautiful until verse 19, where we read, "If only you, God, would slay the wicked. Away from me, you who are bloodthirsty. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, Lord, and abhor those who are in rebellion against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Okay, well, that's a hard right turn, isn't it? I mean, it's a little ironic there that it ends with the writer saying some really violent stuff and then, examine me and see if there's any offensive ways in me. Yeah, we just read it, right? And so what you discover in Psalm 139 is that this is a psalm full of tension. There's incredible poetry and beauty, but then also included, if you get to the end, there is some savage violence toward enemies. This psalm is a living tension. And you can't stop before the end. You got to live in the tension. I mean, our lives are like that, just like Psalm 139. We're sort of a mix as people of beauty and ugliness. We live in this tension of good and evil and some beauty and some ugliness. And texts like this, if we read them all the way through, force us into those conversations. How do we live in beauty when we also exist in a world of tension? Last week after church, we had lunch, a few of us in our in-person gathering, and one of the people I was having lunch with brought up the passages we referenced last week about punishment of God being passed down through generations to the descendants of the person who was the offender. And we noticed last week there were some passages where the writer said that yes, God punishes the descendants of the offender down to the third and fourth generation. And then we read another passage from a different writer, Ezekiel, who said, no, it doesn't work like that. God is not going to punish the children for the sins of the mother and the father. And we point out that there is disagreement in the Bible text about this, that there is a multivocal aspect to the Bible where there are different voices that have different perspectives on God. And so we were talking about that over lunch, and she said, yeah, I get what you're saying. I don't think that God imposes penalties on the offender, on the children of offenders. But she said in another way, though, we actually do pass on some hurts and consequences to our kids. There are parts of us, both good and bad, that our kids inherit, that we pass on to them. There are some generational hurts. There are some generational habits or patterns that we pass on. Even some of the consequences of decisions that we make go on to affect future generations. And so while God may not impose this penalty to the third and fourth generation, sometimes we sort of do. And I thought that was a great insight. And I'd suggest that this is a good way to redeem the text, to allow it to search us for how we end up passing along problems to our kids, rather than just assuming that God punishes innocents for the mistakes of us. And that only happens when we allow the tension of these things to enter into our conversations. And these conversations of tension are what we need, and I would contend are what the Spirit can use to redeem these violent passages. And then the last thing I want to mention that is a way that I think the Spirit can redeem these violent passages is that we begin to recognize within them and sympathize with the cry of grief. Now, some texts in the Bible, some violent texts are due to tribalism and nationalism, the fear of other, and the ancient beliefs that this is how you are to deal with your enemies, that God is always on your side and against those who stand in your way. But there is some of the violent imagery in the Bible that is a little different. It doesn't seem to be tribalistic or nationalistic. it seems to be born in an individual's heart as the cry of a person in pain. An example of this is the strange anti-beatitude about killing babies that we read earlier in our series. Beatitudes are Jesus, blessed are those who, and there's a strange anti-beatitude in Psalm 137 that we read earlier that's rather disturbing. Psalm 137, verse 8, daughter Babylon, okay, those are the enemies of Israel. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction. Blessed is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Blessed is the one who seizes your infants, your babies, and dashes them against the rocks. Now, that is a disturbing verse here, right? Blessed is the one, in other words, God has blessed the one who takes the kids of these Babylonian enemies of ours and smashes them on the rocks. Now, obviously, we start by rejecting the idea that it is indeed blessed by God or should be blessed by anyone else to crush babies against the rocks. We reject that idea right from the beginning. But from there, we can step back and see how human these words are. They're written by someone experiencing deep hurt and suffering and grief. In fact, the way that this psalm starts out is with people crying. In verse 1 it says, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. You see, this psalm is written out of pain and grief. Israel is crushed. They have been defeated. And not just have they been defeated in some game. No, people have died. They've seen their people tortured and killed and abused and left starving. And there has been so much suffering and there has been so much hurt. And the psalm all starts out as they are just sitting along the river crying about everything that they have gone through. It's a truly raw and honest expression of hurt that comes out. And is it blessed to kill babies against a rock? No, of course not. But is it faithful to admit to God honestly how you feel in the moment? I think so. And sometimes those raw honesties, if we're being real about it, how we're really feeling, it's pretty dark. And you don't have to condone these texts to understand how someone could feel the type of grief that leads to their creation. I mean, we've felt those feelings too, haven't we? We've lashed out in our prayers or in our thoughts, even if we never acted on what we said. We said it out loud because it was how we felt in the moment. And if we examined all of those thoughts and feelings that we've ever had, we'd find that some of them are equally as dark. And it reminds us that God can clearly handle our honest expressions of grief. And so perhaps one of the values of these texts then, and one of the ways that they can be redeemed, is in how they might draw us to the suffering experienced by those who act out around us or speak out around us in ways that are inappropriate or offensive. But as we hear that, we remember, perhaps this is being said or being done because this person is in pain. You know the old saying, hurt people hurt people. And when we begin to read the text like this, perhaps the Spirit will lead us to think more deeply and ask questions like, who around you is lashing out? And what about their situation or backstory might be leading to this way of acting out or lashing out? And how might they need compassion? And I would argue that once we start along that road, we may be walking toward a place of redemption. My friend Rick, who we started out with here, he was angry at first that people with HIV got him infected. He was angry. He was a medical doctor. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just trying to do a blood draw and he got stuck with a needle. And he was angry that these people had engaged, some of them, in risky behaviors that had got the virus that had now got him sick because it ruined his life. He lost everything, his job, his family. But in his treatments, he met other people with HIV. He heard their stories. He discovered their pain. And when he got to know them, it changed him. It redeemed his own pain. And he spent the rest of his life giving them compassion. And in that, he found redemption. Are there some ugly parts of the Bible? Yes. And we don't want to justify them. And we can't ignore them or cut them out or pretend like they don't exist. But we can let the Spirit of Jesus redeem them and use them to grow us more into His likeness. After all, that's what Jesus does best. He takes death and He redeems it to life. We want to celebrate that today. We're going to go to communion here. And Billy's going to play a song. And if you want to take communion with us, it's there's nothing magical about communion. There's nothing like taking the bread or the cup. There's nothing magic that happens. Not like you take it and God loves you more or something. It's just a weekly reminder that God can triumph over the worst in life. That God can bring life out of things that seem dead. And truthfully, you and I need reminders of that. We need reminders to see where God is redeeming all sorts of things all over the world in our lives. We want to celebrate that today. Billy's going to lead us in a song, and as he does that, you can take communion, and afterwards I'll come back with some announcements here. But let me pray as we go to it. God, we want to thank you so much for the Bible text. Thank you for the good, the bad, all of it. Thank you that you can take the good, the bad, all of it, and you can use it to point us towards who you are, Jesus. We admit that there are some ugly parts in the Bible text, just as there are some ugly parts in our lives. But thank you that you don't eliminate or get rid of those things. You use them instead. You redeem them, and you use them to help us become all that we are meant to be. Help us as we read this Bible text to be drawn towards you, and help us to be inspired by your love and to inspire others with your love everywhere we go. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Let's go to communion.
Your faithfulness, oh God. You wrestle with the sinner's heart. You lead us by still waters into mercy, and nothing can keep us apart. So remember your people, remember your children, remember your promise, oh God. Your grace is enough, your grace is enough, your grace is enough for me. Your love and justice, God. You use the weak to lead the strong. You lead us in the song of your salvation, and all your people all sing along. So remember your people, remember your children, remember your promise, oh God. Your grace is enough. Your grace is enough. Your grace is enough for me. Hey, your grace is enough. Your grace is enough. Your grace is enough for me. So remember your people, remember your children, remember your promise, oh God. Your grace is enough. Your grace is enough. Your grace is enough for me. Yeah, your grace is enough. Heaven reaching down to us. Your grace is enough for me. Hey, your grace is enough. And I'm covered in your love. Your grace is enough for me. For me. For me. Yeah.
Oh, that's great, Billy. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. As we wrap up here today, a couple announcements, some things that are going on, help you with this next week. First of all, if you want to give and support the Pathways Church community, you can do that by going to our website at findpathways.com/donate. You can make a financial gift there, a one-time gift, or you can make a recurring gift. And man, we are just engaging in a mission here to help people rethink a few things and realize that if you rethink a few things, it doesn't mean you have to throw Jesus out. In fact, perhaps you might find a way of following Jesus that makes more sense to you, that works, and that is quite a mission, and we could use your support in doing it. And so if you want to donate, you can do that today by going to our website. Also, if you want to get more information or just kind of the basic announcement updates, we send out an email newsletter, and if you want to sign up for that, you can do that by messaging us on Facebook and leaving your name and your email address, or you can email me. My email's on the screen there, and just give me your name and email address and say, add me to the list, and we would be happy to do that. Also, we have Theology Pub coming up here in May. I can't believe we're basically in May. I believe tomorrow is May. So we have a couple Theology Pubs coming up again here this next month. Wednesday, May 10th at 6:30 p.m. we'll be at Elliott Bay Pizza in Mill Creek. And then Thursday, May 18th, at 6:30 p.m. we'll be at Five Rights Brewing in Marysville. And if you want to come to either of those, you are welcome to join us there. Also, in our in-person gatherings today, we have our friends from Zion Lutheran Church joining us. They came and visited us in our space and just kind of saw what kind of weirdos we are in person. And so that's a lot of fun, and we're still exploring partnership stuff with them, and so today is a pretty big day for that. That's pretty much it for this week. Hope that you have a really good week. I know the sun's not going to be around forever. In fact, it's not quite as nice today as it was yesterday, but hopefully we're kind of turning the corner here into some spring weather, and I pray you get out into your garden, enjoy the sunshine, and I pray that you're filled with hope everywhere that you go. Okay, have a great week. Talk to you later. Bye.